Our next speaker is Kate Wilson, who is an environmental and social justice activist who was deceived into a long-term relationship by undercover police officer Mark Kennedy. She recently won a truly heroic 4-year battle to have the Metropolitan Police held accountable for Kennedy's abuse. Kate Wilson.
Can you hear me? So, yeah, I'm a core participant in the public inquiry, and I was granted that core participant status because I'm one of an ever-increasing number of women who discovered that I had been abused in this way by an undercover police officer who was sent into my life, into my home, into my parents' home, and into my bed by the Metropolitan Police. Sorry. And I've been asked to talk about why the public inquiry is important, and the first answer to that is a very personal one. One of the most damaging things about this whole story is the continued secrecy, and the inquiry is important to me because it contains the possibility that we may be able to force the police to give me the answers that I need to make sense of that life story, to reconcile myself with the past, and to maybe move on. And I'm sure that many people here actually share that deep personal need for answers about who and how far and why their intimacy and their human rights were being abused in this way. And there are many other women in my situation. I'm part of a group of 8 women who has been fighting a court case since 2011. And ours isn't the only ongoing case, and there are new cases coming out all the time. And I believe that there are many, many more women who are still going to discover that this has happened to them. And in the apology that the police issued to 7 of the women involved in my case, they say that these relationships were a gross violation and may well have reflected attitudes towards women that should have no part in the culture of the Metropolitan Police. And you can feel them desperately trying to stretch the language in order to avoid using the word sexism. And any woman inside or outside the police force who's come into contact with those attitudes towards women knows that what we're talking about here is institutional sexism. And we've seen from the Macpherson inquiry just how powerful an official recognition of that could be. And so that, for me, is one of the reasons why I think this inquiry is important. I should say that I'm very, very new to this, and this is, being a core participant is a very steep learning curve. And I don't have the kind of experience that the other people on this panel have of these inquiry processes, and I'm slightly terrified at the prospect that I'm still going to be fighting this in 20 years' time. And I don't have the depth and knowledge of information about undercover policing that you can get from groups like the Undercover Research Group or State Watch or the Monitoring Group, who have been covering these issues for a very, very long time. I'm coming from the experience of the 5 years of our court case, which has been a constant battle with the police against their neither confirm nor deny policies, against strikeout attempts, against them sending our case to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, bullying us, and eventually offering people payouts, all of it to avoid having to open up the files. There's been more than a dozen investigations into these undercover policing issues to date, and we still have very, very few answers. And I was at the restriction orders hearing last month, and the same legal team that has been fighting us all the way is representing the police, and they're standing there asking for the entire inquiry to be heard in secret. And when you say public to me, I don't think of public institutions like the police. I think of the people. I think of you and me and the people out there. And I believe, maybe is too strong a word, I hope that there is a possibility to turn this inquiry into a people's inquiry and to find a way to force the police to come clean. But for that, I think we need to keep up the pressure. I don't really have much confidence in the state investigating itself and calling itself to account. And I am also very, very concerned that my participation in the inquiry is going to be providing legitimacy for a process that is about restoring public confidence in the police and in undercover policing as a tactic. We only have an inquiry at all because of the work that was done by activists and whistleblowers to expose the behaviour of these units. And we only have a small fraction of the information about what really went on. And I think we probably still have very little idea just how bad things really were. But where we've got to so far is that they have more or less been forced to abandon the attempts to say that Mark Kennedy was just a rogue officer, that the SDS was just a rogue unit that's been shut down, and to stop looking at these abuses in isolation. But we've still got a very long way to go, and I think the first step and the thing that we all need to be united around is this issue of them releasing the cover names, releasing the list of organisations that were being infiltrated by these units, so that we can start to get from the activists, from the people who have been trying to bring this into the public domain, some idea of just how bad this really is. I also want to say that there are certain abuses and the treatment of some core participants that have caused particular outrage, and the Lawrence family are certainly one, and the families of those children who died and had their identities stolen, us women and our families who were deceived into these relationships, which even the Metropolitan Police have said were abusive, deceitful, manipulative and wrong. But I think we need to be careful of not getting caught into this idea that undercover policing is a legitimate tactic and the police have somehow overstepped their remit and abused the innocent. Mark Kennedy lived with me as my partner for over a year. He infiltrated himself into my family life, but that isn't my whole story. In the late 1990s, I was involved in Reclaim the Streets, where I met Jim Boyling, and also a man who I knew as Jason Bishop. In 2002, I used to stay in a housing co-op in Nottingham where I would sit down to dinner with a man who was known to us as Rod Richardson and go out for drinks with him and other friends. Between 2003 and 2009, I was involved in the Dissent Network. And as well as Mark Kennedy, I also met a woman known as Lynn Watson, who I worked with in a first aid group, and a man known as Marco Jacobs. Those surveillance operations were not limited to England and Wales. I came into contact with Marco in France, I met Lynn in Scotland, and after my relationship with Mark ended, I moved to Berlin and he followed me there, and he came into my home in Berlin, infiltrated my group of friends there. I've managed to get a small amount of information from the police about what was on my files, and one of the things that includes is a note from 2012, which is a year after our court case started, showing that the Spanish police were informing the Metropolitan Police about my whereabouts and activities. And in March 2014, I found a GPS tracker stuck underneath my car with a Spanish SIM card in it. So my story clearly isn't the story of an innocent woman who was preyed upon by a rogue officer. I've been the subject of systematic surveillance and violations of my intimacy, my right to privacy, my bodily integrity, at least for the last 18 years, by police forces that are cooperating across European borders. Put simply, that is a story of human rights abuse and persecution by secret political police because of my beliefs and my political activities. And it reads like something straight out of a mid-20th century totalitarian regime, but it was taking place in Britain and the supposedly democratic states of the European Union. I don't have a criminal record and I don't have any convictions of any kind. But it doesn't matter, because we know that people are singled out for infiltration because they're part of a political group or part of a movement not because they're considered to be criminal or violent. And the HMIC report on undercover policing says that the MPOIU officers were deployed to develop general intelligence rather than gathering material for specific prosecutions. And what that means is it's not about crime, it's about political policing. And even going down to the level of political policing being about protecting the reputation of the police against families like the Lawrence who might cause them some embarrassment. And the Snowden revelations have showed the extent to which states like the UK are spying on everybody in their own populations and the low regard that they have for our privacy and our intimacy. And the people who defend those operations make vague and generally quite unsubstantiated references to national security, to serious crime, to domestic extremism. And a lot of the time, that seems to make even the most staunch civil rights campaigners back down and say, well, actually, okay, yeah, of course we must have undercover policing, but we need to make sure that it's properly controlled. And I want to say that I think covert police surveillance of a country's own population has no place in any democracy. The wholesale political policing of dissent is unacceptable. And it's part of a well-established anti-democratic tradition of persecuting people for their beliefs, for which Britain vilifies what are supposedly less democratic states. And even if you talk about domestic extremism or terrorism, the problem is always going to be how and who defines what that is. And the HMIC talks about a test that was applied for undercover policing, which is that there has to be prior reasonable suspicion that serious criminal acts may be in preparation. And it's quite significant that they don't specify that those subjected to the deeply intrusive infiltration of their intimate lives actually have to be involved in those serious criminal acts that are being prepared. And collateral intrusion is a term that appears quite frequently in the Metropolitan Police Codes of Practice and in some of the authorisations. And I presume that my mother and father, my brother, his partner, my 90-year-old grandmother, and possibly even myself fell into that category. And what the cases that we're talking about involve serious violations of basic human rights. And I've experienced the psychological damage that these operations can cause. And it's deep and it's long-lasting. And I think that the intrusiveness and the psychological violence that's inherent in these tactics, and not just the sexual relationships, but the intimacy, the abuse of trust, which is completely inherent to any undercover policing operation, could be seriously underestimated by anyone who hasn't actually been subjected to that tactic. And I'm sure that the police and the Home Office would tell me that my opinion on this is not an informed one, and I don't really understand the threats that we're facing. And it's true, I might be entirely ignorant of the issues involved, and I think probably most of us are, and I think that's the point. I don't have access to the information. The public doesn't have access to the information that we would need to be able to make an informed decision about this. What we have is secret operations, secret reports, secret courts where the complaints get heard if you ever manage to find out that you've been subject to one of these operations. And we're supposed to take it on trust that this is necessary. And I was lied to, I was violated, and we have them banged to rights, and they're still lying to us. And the establishment closes ranks, and they hide the truth behind these references to national security, and they want to have this inquiry held behind closed doors. They banish human rights hearings to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. They invent policies of neither confirm nor deny. And then they threaten whistleblowers like Peter Francis with the Official Secrets Act. So we still know next to nothing about how they made the frankly depraved operational decisions that they made in our cases. I don't know on what basis they consider what they did to me to have been justified, proportionate or necessary. These people are liars. That's the bottom line. Yet they think that the public should be taking what they do on trust. And I don't think that shadowy, unaccountable establishment figures should be allowed to get on with the business of policing, even if other establishment figures are signing off on it behind closed doors. And that's probably the kind of extremist belief that got me marked out for infiltration in the first place. But actually now the Home Office has called for an inquiry into undercover policing and into the legitimacy of undercover policing of political movements in this country. And I think that that's a very, very serious thing and an unprecedented chance for the people to actually get access to that information and for there to be a genuine democratic examination of whether these tactics are legitimate. And that's important not just to me and not just to the people who were infiltrated, but to everybody. So that's why I'm involved in the public inquiry. That said, I'll stop there. Okay, I'll wind up. Well, what I actually wanted to conclude was that last summer I was in Berlin and I went to the Stasi Museum and I learned there that I knew that people who were victims of the Stasi are able to now go to the Stasi headquarters and apply for their files. What I didn't know was that wasn't something that happened as a natural result of the wall coming down and people realising how horrible that was. That happened because people went on hunger strike, because people stormed the Stasi offices and stopped them destroying the files. And it happened as a result of direct action taken by the people of the GDR. And so I think we need to be aware that the legal processes, the public inquiry, is not going to be voluntarily handing this over. And that I want to say, please support the Undercover Research Group. They're doing amazing work. They don't have the funding that the inquiry has or that Operation Hearn has, but they're the ones that have got all the information out there so far that we know about. Yeah, let's find out where the warehouses are, where they're keeping this information and get it in the public domain.
Thanks very much, Kate.